This is Andrew Clendenin with the World of Texas Music on the web at WTXM.org. Today's podcast will feature Harrison Collins. Harrison is a 19-year-old freshman in college and has been composing classical music since he was 14 years old. Harrison's classical compositions have received many awards, and many of his compositions have been performed around the United States. Harrison, welcome to the World of Texas Music. Harrison J. Collins, you started composing when you were 14 years old. Currently, you're 19 years old. You've completed 14 compositions, and 6 more are in progress. You've won several awards, and your music has been performed by orchestras around the country. That's very impressive. Has anyone referred to you as a prodigy?
Perhaps once or twice. I think many people try to avoid the term. Some others embrace it a lot. If anybody would call me that, it would be my parents. They, I think, noticed it from the very beginning, and thankfully they've been very supportive and have pushed me in that direction as much as they can. Happy birthday, Mom, by the way.
Shout out to Mom.
Yeah. I think other people have perhaps danced around it. They don't want me to get a big head.
Right.
I don't want to get a big head. I try not to. But, I've spoken to people who've compared me to John Williams or other names of that caliber, and I'm not so sure about it, but it is a huge honor for somebody to even think of me as being at that level, especially at my age.
Right. I agree. I definitely agree with that.
Thank you.
You grew up in North Texas near Dallas.
Yes, sir. Little Elm, Texas. Born and raised. Actually, I moved there when I was 1, so that's all I remember. It's a great little town.
What was it like growing up in that part of the state?
I'd say it's probably the best place in the country to grow up for doing what I wanted to do. Before that, it was just any other town. It didn't matter much to me because I didn't know much else at that point. My mom wanted me to be a football player when I was young.
Of course.
But
it's Texas.
Right, yeah. But I was in kindergarten or first grade, and I didn't like the way the mouthpiece felt, so it was a no from me. So, but once I got into music, North Texas is an exceptional place for music, and so it was really easy to find the connections I needed to get started.
What age would you say you really felt like you were moving toward music?
Hard to say. I started piano when I was in 5th grade, and I took lessons for a while. It wasn't really my thing, but I did enjoy the music aspect of it. Shortly after, in 6th grade, was when I joined the band program in school. My brother had done it, my older brother, and so that's why I did it, because I wanted to be like him.
Sure.
I wanted to play the saxophone, and I joined at that time. Woodwind players were required to start their first semester on clarinet. So I came in on clarinet, took some lessons for that, and I found that I was pretty good at it. And my band director told me and essentially decided for me that I was going to play the bassoon. And I said, I would really like to play saxophone, but he was much taller and much scarier than I. And he said, you're going to play the bassoon. So I played the bassoon, and so that was how I got into it, how I got into the music thing. It wasn't until 2 years later or so that I really got into composition. And
where did you learn the concept of composition at such a young age?
Well, I guess I always had a sense listening to the music that we played that I would rather it sound slightly different. I would listen to a lot of the pieces that we would play in school, and I would think, if I had written this, I probably would have done something a little different. But that was sort of it for a while, and then I sort of realized that I could just do it myself. What
was the moment that you realized that? Could you remember?
I think the moment that I really decided I wanted to try was during a band camp in between 7th and 8th grade, and I played a piece called Cut to the Chase by Todd Stalter, and I did not realize that music could sound like that. I loved that piece. I still do. And when I heard that, I was like, that's how I want to write music. and I'm going to do it.
So that was your inspiration.
Right. So that's how it began. And then I wrote my first piece, and my band directors were really excited to see that I was interested in it. And so I gave them this piece, and they gave it to our band at the middle school, and they gave me a baton, and they put me on the podium, and they said, make it happen.
Conductor.
Right. So I conducted the world premiere of my very first piece in 8th grade, and I turned around, and I heard the loudest applause I have ever heard in my life still. And that was...
There you go.
Yeah,
that's the blast off.
And that was the moment.
Sure.
I was watching this crowd, and I took a bow, and in my head, I decided this is what I want to do for the rest of my life.
That's a great story. Now, back to the saxophone.
Yeah.
Why did you choose the saxophone?
I thought it was cool.
Okay, just the cool factor of the sax.
Yeah.
Okay.
You know, everybody knows how cool the saxophone is.
You bet. What is your first memory of music?
Elementary school. You know, we had... they were called specials, and it's, you know, what it was different depending on what day of the week it was, but sometimes it was gym, and sometimes it was art, and sometimes it was music, and something else I don't remember, but music was always my favorite, and it always felt so short when it happened, and I just remembered that I loved it, and that it just really stuck with me, I think.
So something inside of you was awakened? Can we use that
Yeah,
term?
I believe so, definitely. And you know, I guess that's when I started, after that happened was when I really became aware, but from that point on, I was always just very aware of music, I think. I found myself listening really intently to the music that my parents would play on the radio.
Which was what genre?
Generally rock. And alternative sort of stuff. My dad used to play 102.1 The Edge.
All right.
And that's what I'd listen to all the time. And so that was sort of where I got that. And then classical came to me, and I was like, oh, I like this too, and so on.
So you really have touched on all types of music.
Perhaps.
As far as listening.
Yeah.
For composition, with the talent you have, clearly, you could do pop, rap?
Perhaps.
So you're not drawn to that necessarily?
Not necessarily, and I think it would take a different skill set than I have. I think maybe if we consider talent an aspect, then I think maybe I could pull it off, but I think that my skill set and my interests both lend towards gravitation to classical music.
Right. It seems to me, and correct me if you think I'm off here, but that your music's classically structured, but you seem to be a little bit anchored in the mid-20th, late 20th century, style-wise. In other words, you have a modern take on some classical components. Is that accurate?
Yeah, I believe so, okay. And I believe that I have been much more aware of that recently than I ever have before, and actually, recently, I have been making an effort to do more of that. I'm writing a piece right now. Is a concerto for trombone and wind ensemble. So there's a wind ensemble and there's a trombone soloist who's featured throughout the piece. And the piece, I am making an effort to draw from the music of 20th century American composers like Copland and like Vincent Persichetti and William Schumann and composers of music of that nature.
Why the trombone?
Because it was commissioned.
Okay. That's enough said.
Right, yeah.
In high school, you worked in theater and performed in several plays. Actors are trained to express emotions. Can you compare acting to composing?
Absolutely.
Tell us about it.
Well, any art form, you can draw many parallels to any other art form. As far as acting goes, acting was a really great outlet for my very outgoing personality. It was sort of natural to me at the time. I also joined theater because my brother had done theater previously. Ironically, I ended up doing theater and band much longer than my brother did in school. And I think I did both of those things, acting and composing, for the same reason. As artists, what we do comes from the ego. We feel inside that what we have to say is important enough that other people should hear it. And that is sort of where that comes from for me to compose and to act, is a way of giving what I have to others and feeling that it's worthy of being heard by others.
So you're a tough judge on the outcome of that, I think.
Absolutely. I've always had higher expectations for myself than anybody else, which is tough at times, most times.
Do you think most artists feel the same way?
I think so.
So there's sometimes a little bit of a monkey on the back.
Oh, surely. A gorilla, perhaps.
A gorilla. On a bad day, a gorilla.
Right.
Let's talk about the creative process. It's a little bit of a murky place to be. Tell me about how you feel about the creative process.
It's different for everyone, certainly, but you can find a lot of similar things between people. When I was younger, I just made it up as I went along, and that worked pretty well for me.
Sure.
As I've grown older, as I need to grow as an artist, challenge myself, you got to think about it a little harder. For example, it's much easier to describe it in concrete terms rather than, as a whole. For example, on this trombone concerto that I'm working on, I knew from the beginning that I wanted to have that 20th century feel to it. Then the question is how, and then the question is why. The soloist who's going to be performing the solo trombone part, John Romero, who is the principal trombonist of the Metropolitan Opera in New York City, he told me that he would like to hear Renaissance music. And it was important to me that I honor that request. But then the question is, well, how do I fit that in with 20th century American music?
Of course.
So it's that sort of thing where you have to ask yourself these questions, and you have to build a foundation. And so I answered those questions. I found a theme for my music, which is a piece that addresses some modern American issues, particularly gun violence and climate change. And then from there, now I have my foundation. I know what my piece is about. How do I actually express that in the music? And then it goes into more minute details. But
right.
Still part of it, and I think that a lot of professional composers still do this, part of it is still making it up as you go along, which is the important thing to know, because sometimes I'm not thinking about how it's going to fit in. I just find a musical moment, and I'm like, that sounds cool.
Right.
And then the question becomes, how do I make that make sense? That sort of thing.
That's the art.
Right. It's the, you can't plan everything out. You can try your best, and you can do a lot of it to make the piece make more sense and give it, a sense of wholeness. But part of it is just what's in the moment, just what happens in the mind, and that's the artist.
And particularly this trombone player gave you a directive.
Right.
So you had to work somewhat within that directive.
Right. And that is both restricting but also freeing. Because if you are given every tool imaginable, you wouldn't even know what to build.
Exactly.
But if somebody gives you a hammer and a nail and a piece of wood, you just got to figure it out.
Less can be more.
Exactly.
Sounds like a challenge.
Yes, I would say so. But a fun one.
Definitely. You are a bassoon player.
Yes.
The word bassoon sounds so exotic to me, but I researched its history, and the meaning is bundle of sticks. Do you ever think you're playing a bundle of sticks?
Sort of. Kind of looks like one.
Tell us about that.
Well, it's, heck, you probably know as much about the history as I do.
Probably not, but go ahead.
It's a really interesting instrument. It comes from the Renaissance instrument, the dulcian, I think, is the predecessor.
That's right. Exactly.
And your guess is as good as mine as for what specifically bundle of sticks means, other than I think probably just because it looks like one. It's big and tall and long and skinny. It's a challenging instrument. It's and exotic, perhaps. Yes, it's not the instrument you think of when you think of an instrument,
right?
If you know what I mean.
Sure.
But it is a very interesting one, and it's fun to me to be able to tell people that I play the bassoon, because they're like, some people know what it is and some people don't. And they're like, what? And it's tough to describe if you've never seen one before. Sometimes I just tell them, you just got to search it up on Google Images, and trust me, because that's what it looks like.
Well, you hold it like a broom as you were sweeping.
Yeah, essentially.
And it's a tube.
Right.
It has valves.
It has keys. And holes that you open and close with your fingers, although some of those are some of the fingers play on holes directly, some of them play on keys that close holes somewhere else on the instrument, and then there are 1,000 other keys on it that press other holes elsewhere. The bassoon is different from a lot of woodwind instruments. A lot of woodwind instruments, you play extra keys with your pinkies. And that's the same on the bassoon, but on the bassoon you play 1, 2, 3-ish, 4, 5 keys with your pinkies. You don't play any keys with your thumbs on any other woodwind instrument except for maybe one, but on the bassoon there are 13 thumb keys. 13.
Lots of thumbs.
Yes, and it requires a very wide reach. A lot of people have trouble playing the bassoon if they have small hands. Lucky for me, I have average-sized hands, so, I can handle it pretty well.
How long or tall is this instrument? You've got one right in the case. You could just pull it up and we can take a look.
Sure do. I got to be honest, I am terrible at estimating length.
Say 4 feet, maybe?
Yeah, probably.
So would you play a little bit for us and maybe play a little bit of a piece and then just noodle around with it and tell us what the sound is or what you're trying to make the sound coming out of that instrument to be?
Yeah, sure. I can play some parts from one of my band pieces, A Rose of May. Little opening there.
Sure.
It's been a while since I played this thing, so sorry.
That's okay. That sounded great. So that I can already tell it's got quite a range.
Yes. It's a huge range for a woodwind instrument. It goes from, which is a B flat 2, all the way up to highest note I can play, which is a D4.
I can see a little on the D4. I can see a little grimacing on your face. So you're having to really push this instrument.
Yeah.
Understand that it takes a lot of lung diaphragm pressure.
Yes.
To actually move enough air. To actually have the sound.
Well, and sort of one of the unique things about the bassoon is that it's a double reed instrument. A lot of woodwind instruments, except for the flute, have one reed against a mouthpiece. And that's how you play the instrument is you blow on the mouthpiece and the reed vibrates against the mouthpiece. A double reed instrument, the mouthpiece is replaced by another reed. And so it's two pieces of wood vibrating against each other. Usually, I am currently playing a synthetic Leger reed. And so it creates a really interesting sound, and it takes a lot of air pressure because not a lot of air gets through.
Yeah, that tube is pretty small. I mean, that's not much larger than a large straw.
Right. So often the challenge, the breath challenge with playing this and oboe, which is the same way, is not so much running out of breath, but actually holding your breath in too long and having just it getting stale, and you have to let it out and get in new, fresh air to keep playing. Because
I noticed a little vibrato in there, and I assume you're doing that.
Yes.
With your diaphragm.
Doing my best. Yes.
That sounded great.
Well, thank you.
Difficult instrument to play.
Absolutely.
For sure.
And difficult to learn, particularly.
Sure. What do you think, in your opinion, is the best blending instrument with the bassoon?
As a composer,
of course,
I'm not sure I can answer that question, because I think every instrument blends with every other instrument in a different and unique and important way. I can tell you what I really like personally is the sound of bassoon blending with clarinets and French horns. I really like that sound. I think those instruments together particularly create a sound that is almost human in quality. And so that's a sound that I really love is clarinet, bassoon, French horn. Also goes great with saxophones and oboes, even trumpet. Trumpet and bassoon is a really interesting and really cool combination.
Yeah, I can sense the richness of that.
Yeah.
Do you compose on the bassoon?
No. As a matter of fact, not at all, really. Often I compose on a keyboard.
Okay, so you'll take a piano,
right,
or digital piano.
Yeah, I've had one since I started piano lessons in 5th grade, and I didn't end up playing piano, but I continued to play piano in the sense that I use it to develop ideas and to have some fun every once in a while.
Why not? Let's talk a little bit more about the creativity side of this, because your music is, to me, full of creativity. I'm wondering, do you sing in the shower, or do you hum something? How does this happen?
Of course I sing in the shower. It's everywhere to me.
Music is everywhere.
Music is everywhere.
So music is a breeze blowing through the trees?
Absolutely. In a scientific sense, everything has pitch.
Sure.
And I think I consider it my responsibility to find the music within that and to find the music in everyday life, because if you're a musician and you're not looking for music, what are you doing, in my opinion? As far as in a more concrete, creative sense, the ideas just sort of come and go. It's almost not really my choice. There's a very, very wise composer who passed away last year, I think, or the year before last. His name's David Maslanka. And he sort of talked about how, as a composer, his job was to let the music be itself. His job was to find it and then just let it go and let it be as whole as possible. So he didn't speak of himself really as a composer. He spoke of himself as almost as it was almost as if he was watering a plant.
Watering a plant.
I don't know. That's the best I can think of. I'm not nearly as wise as David Maslanka was, but he saw the music as separate from him, and as it was his responsibility to oversee that. And I thought that was really interesting, because I as a younger composer, I find that I don't really have a choice for when the ideas come and when the music comes to me. It just happens, and I can try, and I can take an idea and I can work to develop that and use my skills to grow the music, but the seeds don't come at my command.
Right. I've heard a lot of artists say much the same thing, that it doesn't really come from them. They're somewhat of a conduit.
Right.
And
excellent word.
Comes through them, and then all of their experiences and the way they've developed their craft is how this picture comes out, if you will. Yeah.
Absolutely.
So creativity is an elusive thought, but I'm really interested in hearing what artists have to say about creativity.
Sure.
The descriptions of your compositions are very thoughtful. It seems that you have mentally designed a thematic structure before you start to compose. Is that a fair statement?
Absolutely. Most music, I have a solid, concrete thought in mind before I start writing. And usually, in most cases, not all, I need that to really write the music. Otherwise, I just feel like I'm not doing it right if I don't have that idea in mind.
You feel like you're not doing it right.
Right.
Tell me about that.
Some people, they don't title their music, in the sense that they'll write a piece and they will call it a, I've got an acquaintance of mine who, his name's Daniel Zarb Cousin, and he writes orchestra music, and he doesn't like to title his music. And we had a conversation about this. He doesn't like to title his music. He has a largo for orchestra. Mm-hmm. He has a fantasy for orchestra, but he doesn't title things farther than that. He thinks it's sort of a band thing. He particularly is not a huge fan of band music, while I, on the other hand, am quite the fan of it as I write it. For me, I need that.
Right.
If I were to write a largo for orchestra, I have no idea where I'd begin. And kudos to him for having a lock on absolute music and just focusing on the music. I think that's a really awesome thing. For me, what's important to me is that I find a meaning that is separate from the music and imbue that within.
So you have that. Where does the emotion come in?
Great question. I try to pull off that, whatever my inspiration is. I just try to use that as a guide, and whatever emotions that sort of thing makes me feel is what I try to reflect in my music. If you're writing absolute music like Daniel, it comes from your musical choices. And other than that, I'm not sure, because that's not how I write. But and by the way, I don't mean to say that either is better than the
Sure.
other. I think Daniel's a great composer. For me, all emotions in my music are guided by why I'm writing it and what I'm writing it about.
So that's ever present in the back of your mind.
Yes.
So you have this theme, as we talked about, that's already structured in your mind.
Yes. And often when I write, it is guided. Before I write music, I know emotionally how it's going to travel.
How so? How do you come to that understanding?
For example, with this trombone concerto, whose title, by the way, is The Beginning of Spring, I picture it as the piece as a whole is sort of my personal vision of the experience of being a young American in current America. And so I really want to travel the full emotional gamut of what it is to be an American in a very peculiar time for our country. And so I just sort of made these decisions beforehand that the work is cast in 3 movements, and the first movement focuses on frustration and anger. And the second movement sort of transitions to helplessness and to despair, but also to reflection and meditation of a sort. The third movement, I like to consider as a 50-50 mix of hope and anxiety. So I just made those choices because those are all emotions that I have felt in the sense of being an American.
Right.
And those are all emotions that I have felt watching the trajectory of our country. So those are musical choices that I've made based on what I've experienced and what I think that others have experienced as well.
So hopefully you relate to many people.
Hopefully
with
so.
this emotion.
And that is what is, I think, probably most important to me as a writer.
Yeah, please set your instrument down here.
Yeah, been holding that for a while.
Yeah.
That is, I think, what's most important to me as a writer is to connect to other people.
So how do you achieve that?
It's sort of luck. Honestly.
The secret's out. It's luck. Yeah.
Right. Well, and there just is really nothing I can do except my best. And to, I just do my job, which is to be as genuine as possible and be as real with my music and just say something that is truly what I mean and is honest and genuine and is vulnerable.
Right.
And then if it connects with other people, then I've done my job.
Authenticity,
Yes.
honesty, being genuine does touch people in any form of art.
Mm-hmm.
The timing may not be right. As you
Sure.
know, many artists pass on and nobody even thinks about them, and then years later they're discovered, quote
Right.
unquote, and the emotion of the time or the moments of the time
Mm-hmm.
are attached in some way to
Sure.
that art. So here again, this creativity thing is elusive in how it affects people,
Absolutely.
because after all, these are sound waves that are hitting
Right.
people's eardrums, and there's space between you the audience and the instrument are the people that are playing the music.
Right.
So it's very mercurial in some ways as to why things work. How do you start a composition? You have this mental picture. Do you write it down first, or do you go to the keyboard?
Generally, I will write it first.
Okay.
And once I've written it down, I can hear it. And once I can hear it, I can refine it. And so often I will write it down exactly as I hear it in my head. And once I hear it out loud through my notation software, I will realize that doesn't sound as cool as I thought it would. And then, but then I can take that concept and I can refine it and I can turn it into something that does sound good. I often come up with my endings first. The way a piece ends is really important to me. I've always loved endings. Which is not to say I don't love the rest of pieces too. I've just always been fascinated by how people, take their music and wrap it up. And so that sort of manifested itself in the sense that I tend to come up with that first.
So then you have the front of the music and the middle.
Right. And so the question is...
beginning.
Right. And the question for me often is what music can be wrapped up in this manner. I'm about to begin writing a saxophone ensemble piece. And I had this idea for an ending, and it was for a different piece, but that didn't really work out, and so I've got this ending sitting around. And I thought this ending might sound interesting if it was played by a saxophone ensemble. And I had this idea, this sort of vague idea for a piece a few weeks ago. I didn't really think much about it, but then it sort of occurred to me that this idea I had for this piece would sort of fit this ending, which would sort of fit the saxophone ensemble. So
all fell together.
Right. So, now it comes down to I've sort of taken those three individual points and I've put them together, and now I need to write a piece around it.
So sometimes the artist really has to pay attention to the idea that the song will lead them to the finished product.
Definitely.
And when you step out of that, sometimes you struggle because you're not really listening to the song.
Yes, absolutely.
You find that in your own work?
Yeah, and I mean, that's, again, I think it's so important to treat the music as separate from yourself.
Right, as you said before.
Yeah, and so if
water the plant.
Right, you have to water the plant. If you're not listening, if you're not watering the plant, it's not going to grow.
Ophelia, a character in Shakespeare's Hamlet, inspired you to write the composition O Rose of May. Your comment about Ophelia, and I quote, meets a very dark fate. It's fun stuff. What did you mean by that comment?
Well, it's Shakespeare, Shakespeare is, I think it's, you got to find the humor in Shakespeare, even his darkest work, just because he was such a humorous guy, So I read, obviously I'd known the name Hamlet forever. It was required reading my senior year of high school, and I wasn't, never gotten around to reading it before that. So I read it and was like, okay, I get it now. This is a good story. This is interesting. And it got to a point that I describe in the program notes of the piece where Ophelia has gone insane. And by the way, if you're listening and you don't already know the story of Hamlet, spoiler alert, but it's been several hundred years. Ophelia has gone insane, and her brother Laertes sees her and calls out to her sort of and refers to her as O Rose of May. And I read that, and I immediately thought, I am going to write a piece with that title.
Boom. Something hit you.
Yeah. I like the story enough. I love writing about literature. And it just sort of fell into place. And it hit me. And I really, and that's sort of what sparked it. And I really thought Ophelia's character arc was interesting. And I thought that it was sort of overshadowed by the other events of the play, but I thought it was worth focusing on.
Right.
But it's, you got to remember it's not real. So it is really heavy. It's dark, but it's, it's like, it's whatever. Fun stuff. Shakespeare.
Tell us about another composition entitled The Paper Man.
The Paper Man is similarly inspired by literature. The difference is the literature is my own. And actually, it also springs from high school English classes. This was my freshman year. I was in pre-AP English, which, looking back, was a terrible choice. and we had a short story assignment and had to write a short story, like 5 pages or something like that. And I take that sort of stuff seriously. I tend to stress myself out over it because I can't settle for if when it comes to anything artistic, I can't settle for just what happens. I have to push myself to do something good, which is, I think, probably good, but in the moment, usually pretty stressful. And so I spent 4 days of the full 5-day week we had to work on this story with nothing. I couldn't even start because I didn't have a good idea. And then the 5th day, this idea hits me. And the idea comes from a few weeks before, after spring break. This assignment was after spring break. My band program, my high school band program, takes band vacations during spring break every year. And so we, over spring break, had taken a vacation to Disney World. Real cool stuff. We were driving to Florida, and I was sitting next to my best friend, and it was like 3 a.m. on the charter bus. And my buddy, Augustine, gets real silly when he's tired. And so he says, "Harrison, tell me a bedtime story." So I'm like, "Okay, buddy, I'll tell you a bedtime story." So I just pulled a story straight out of my butt, just made it up as I went along. And, it was all right. It's sort of a funny story. There are dinosaurs in it and this silly romance and that sort of thing. So flash forward to this English assignment, it hits me. I could just write down that bedtime story I told him. So I did. And I called it The Paper Man. And it's got this guy, and it's got this woman, and it's got these paper cranes everywhere, and it's got dinosaurs in it. And it's just a really sort of non-logical, silly, fun, sweet story that I wrote. And it ended up being really popular. We had to read the stories we wrote to our class. And so I had to read it to my class, and it ended up being rather popular. As a matter of fact, I would later go on to put The Paper Man on my Letterman jacket. That was sort of, I was a legend for like a week in my school, And so that's it. At some point, it just felt natural to me as a writer. As a composer, rather, I just was like, I need to write a piece about the Paper Man. And originally I started writing it for band. I had this opportunity that came up to submit a piece to the National Young Composers Challenge. And that is an orchestra challenge. It's where I met Daniel Zarb Cousin. So I wrote it for orchestra. I submitted it. I won. I went there. I heard them perform the piece, and then I arranged it for wind ensemble afterwards. I think it's one of my favorite pieces that I've written. It's just very sweet, very silly, very fun. I think it really embodies the character of what I was going for with my story. What I don't tell many people, but what will happen, mark my words.
Yes.
The piece is not finished. It's a 5-minute piece right now. I treat it as a full, standalone piece.
Right.
My goal is for this 5 minutes to be the first movement of a 3-movement piece.
Ah.
The story is in 3 parts, 6 pages. Each part is 2 pages. And I say, to keep things simple, that the piece is about the story, but actually the piece is about the first 2 pages of the story. And eventually I will have 2 extra movements that complete the story.
Is that in your mind already?
Oh, absolutely.
So the question is, are you the man in the story?
No.
Okay.
No. This man is much more interesting and much more neurotic than I am.
I'm glad we've got that disclosure. So today we have access to all types of music. Never before in history have people been able to hear so much different music anytime they want on many devices. Mm-hmm. What do you think the next phase of music is going to be?
Your guess is as good as mine. It's sort of a natural progression, the way music grows. Obviously, back in the old days, we had classical music because that's what was available to us.
Right.
We had those instruments. We had people who could play those instruments. That's what we could do. As new instruments become available, obviously we start playing on those instruments, and it just goes from there. And when technology sort of boomed, and suddenly this new technology became available to us, we started creating music that way. And that's valid. That is, in a sense, its own instrument. It's very different from the ones we've
Sure.
known for centuries, but it is an instrument. And we are creating music through it.
So synthesizers
Right.
is what you're talking about.
Right. But after that, that leads us to here, where we create music both acoustically and synthetically. Who knows where it
Sky's
goes
the
from here.
limit.
Right. Well, I mean, we have everything we need in our hands, and every day we are creating new things.
So if an artist creates something in Ableton or Fruity Loops or plethora of other software, are they as legitimate as someone who's worked 15 years working on their craft and developing the talent to play a certain instrument?
Absolutely. And I say that because I think different instruments are available to people with different skill sets. I would probably be pretty bad at writing synthetic music.
Right.
Because that's not what I'm wired for, in a sense. That's not, what.
Have you tried?
A little bit. I'm really bad with sound software. I just don't have experience. But people that, as I've spent 7-8 years playing the bassoon, the people who write that way, who use sound software, they've spent many years doing that.
Sure.
So their skill set is geared towards that. So it's different, but it is certainly, in my opinion, no less valid. Everybody puts time and energy into their craft.
Sure. And as you said, it's an instrument.
Right.
It's not what we think of traditionally
Absolutely.
as a musical instrument, but indeed it is an instrument.
Yeah.
What one of your compositions would you like to take us out with? You mentioned a favorite.
Yeah. Well, it's funny because you mentioned both of them. O Rose of May and The Paper Man are two of my favorites right now. I have other favorites, but those are my two favorites that I have good live recordings of. I think, man, you sure did put me on the spot here. I'd say I'd like to take it out on O Rose of May, I think.
O Rose of May.
O Rose of May. O Rose of May is slightly newer, and I'm really proud of it. It's the product of a lot of hard work. It was premiered at a really prestigious event, the Midwest Clinic in Chicago, Illinois. It was a real privilege. It was played by a fantastic band, and it's a great recording, and I would love to share that with more people.
That's what we'll go out on.
All right.
Harrison J. Collins, thank you so much for joining the world of Texas music.
My pleasure.
This is Andrew Clendenin with the World of Texas Music. On the web at WTXM.org. Come visit us there. We'll respond to emails from you. We'd like your comments. Thanks for listening.